A cold morning at the Dukla Pass, North Ridge above Vyshny Komarnik. By midday, 1st Panzer Army's roadblock doctrine no longer worked. The reason fit inside a single T-34 track shoe, wide enough to bite into sodden alpine turf the maps had marked impassable. Subscribe for restrained, evidence-first World War II investigations. New videos every day. Dawn came with a low ceiling and intermittent drizzle on the 8th of September, 1944. On the Slovak side of the Dukla corridor, the tree line sat around 900 meters above sea level, its spruce edges slick with mist. German barrier units under 1st Panzer Army had mined the valley road, pre-registered kill zones on bends south of Lyubomirova, and emplaced anti-tank guns to cover culverts and stone bridges in a layered scheme that assumed Soviet armor would remain. Roadbound. The old rule, here, was printed in the field orders of the previous autumn. Armor in the east. Carpathians moved where the road and the valley led it. That morning, 4th Ukrainian Front arrived with a different interpretation. The human lever was a corpus-level decision written in pencil on a soggy map case. A Soviet deputy commander attached to 38th Army authorized a mixed battalion group to test the forest spurs west of the highway instead of reinforcing the road. Column. The group included T-34s from a tank brigade habitually supporting rifle divisions, a sapper company with pioneer saws and sectional fascines, and a light signals detachment. The order pushed 2 platoons past the last marked forestry track, and up a slope locals knew as the back of the ridge, a meadow banding uphill between spruce stands at gradients, the German engineer tables classified as red. The authorization broke the old rule in 2 sentences. Tanks would climb where tanks supposedly could not. The surprise mechanic lived in a printed range table and a maintenance card more than in any speech. The T-34's wide tracks and tall first gear gave it a documented ability to sustain climbs above 20 degrees on soft ground. Sappers reported ground pressures low enough to avoid cutting ruts to bedrock. A maintenance card from the previous winter, folded twice and stained with oil, recorded a final drive temperature within tolerance at continuous low-gear ascent during training near Rybinsk. It was not glamour. It was a margin. On that morning, the margin became operational. By mid-morning, aerial reconnaissance photographs, grease pencil circles added aboard a low-flying liaison aircraft, showed faint chevrons curling upslope behind a screen of spruce. The photos did not look like roads, they looked like stitching. Those images, clipped and dated in a Division AAR page from the evening, documented that 2 T-34 platoons had cleared a rise 2 kilometers west of the main valley floor, and were now looking down on the lateral logging track that fed the German anti-tank positions. The altitude difference, roughly 200 meters of climb from meadow to shelf, put Soviet optics at an oblique angle to the German gun arcs. Guns zeroed for frontal road shots had no depression to match an enemy that appeared above and behind them. Sappers followed the tank tracks up with hand-cut brush fascines and short ramps, bridging gullies and soft seams. Convoy spacing widened to reduce slippage, a detail captured in a signals log that noted intervals extended to twice normal to preserve turf. The climb rate averaged in the low single digits of kilometers per hour, slow but not stopped. The metric that mattered was not speed, but persistence. Each minute the tanks continued to move, the pre-registered German fields of fire lost another degree of relevance. On the valley floor, German observers sent a decoded summary upstream by noon, reporting armor movement off marked axes and engine noise masked by wind and upper tree line. That message, later translated and summarized in a Soviet intelligence, digest, fix the moment the rule snapped. Anti-tank guns covering the culverts at predictable angles now faced a threat cresting the ridge with the sun at its back and the roadblocks behind it. The time from first slope contact to the first flanking fire on the lateral track, less than 1 hour, collapsed a day's worth of interdiction plans. Witness objects accumulated. An engineer road log, smeared with rain, recorded the ad hoc mathematics of the ascent. Ramp height to wheelbase, fasten weight to bridge a peat seam, the number of saw teams allocated per 100 meters of rise. A range table annotated in pencil showed corrected site marks for firing with the hull canted, because the first flanking rounds were taken from uneven ground at angles outside textbook drills. A maintenance card flagged one track pin shear that sappers replaced under canopy, time logged at 20 minutes. None of it read like a set-piece assault. It read like an audit that happened to point uphill. By early afternoon, 2 consequences were visible on the situation map. First, German road mines that would have forced any armored column to halt and bunch under pre-sighted artillery fire now sat irrelevant while Soviet tanks bled movement into the hills, pointing their guns down and in. Second, infantry companies defending the road realized the tree line above them held silhouettes that should not have been there. Radio nets filled with requests to swing anti-aircraft guns to high-angle ground rolls. Crews manhandled weapons toward clearings that were never surveyed for ground fire. The response was not negligent. It was late. The measurable tactical metric that day was not counted in destroyed vehicles, but in degrees of terrain, converted from no-go to conditional go. An operations officer shaded a new band on the map in blue pencil, marking the upland meadow as transit capable for mediums under sapper escort. That small mark shifted the frontage. Instead of a single road with predictable bends, the battlefield now possessed a second, unregulated lane of approach that mirrored the road from above at a distance of a few hundred meters. When 2 more tank platoons followed the stitched path before dusk, the exception hardened into a method. None of this produced a sweeping, cinematic breakthrough that day. German resilience at the pass is recorded in casualty lists and daily reports that did not yield for weeks. But the rupture at Dukla, armor climbing where the rulebook wrote no, had a shape that commanders could copy. A single map pin in the Carpathians had turned the T-34s' mundane specifications into leverage against a doctrine built around roads, bridges, and culverts. And the after-action pages collected that evening contained a contradiction that planners could not ignore. If tanks could rise above the valley mine belts here, then other red slopes on other fronts were not walls, only costs. The pencil order at Dukla did not stay a field improvisation. Within a week, a typed memorandum from the Armored Directorate reached 4th Ukrainian Front Headquarters, stamped with a date in mid-September entitled Use of Medium Tanks on Non-Road Alpine Slopes. It directed armies to pair each forward tank, brigade with a sapper company trained in hillside transit, to pre-cut brush fascines in set lengths, and to assign a liaison airman to photograph and mark potential upland lanes before an assault. A follow-on circular from the Engineer Administration codified ramp ratios, soil tests with a bayonet probe, and the minimum spacing for tracked vehicles on meadow gradients. The bureaucracy did not praise the idea, it assigned procedures to it. The rollout looked mundane on paper. A rail manifest moving west from Kharkiv listed pallets of Pioneer saws, spare track pins, cable reels, and wooden staves for fascines, alongside the usual ammunition and fuel consignments. A production tally from a Ural plant recorded an uptick in stamped track shoes and final drive gears, earmarked for formations expected to operate in mountains and foothills. The appended note cited anticipated higher wear from constant first gear, climbs. A training bulletin, mimeographed and smudged, instructed drivers to practice oblique uphill approaches to preserve momentum and to avoid clutch feathering that spiked temperatures. These were minor allocations in the scale of the war. Put together, they made the ascent repeatable. Technically, the method rested on plain physics and the T-34s' compromise of power, gearing, and track footprint. Wide tracks spread weight. Ground pressure stayed low enough that turf became a surface rather than a trap. A long travel suspension let the hull sit steady enough on cambers that a gunner could hold a sight mark even when the hull was canted. Low first gear and stout torque allowed movement at walking pace without stalling. Reliability, never absolute, proved adequate. Maintenance summaries from 3 brigades in October recorded roughly 3 and 4 vehicles completing planned ascents without mechanical halt, and of those halted, most restarted after roadside. Attention to thrown tracks or cooling pauses. The doctrine was not a trick. It was a budget. Commanders paid in speed and mechanical attrition for positional advantage. Case Study 1. Bottleneck reversed. In early October, west of Ujak Pass, 38th Army faced a logging road laced with mines and covered by anti-tank guns in a curve that German sappers had measured to the meter. Aerial reconnaissance, flown at treetop height, returned a strip of prints with grease pencil arrows not on the road, but on a slanted meadow band above the gun line. A tank brigade detached 2 companies with an engineer escort to that band. Signals logs show an interval order, doubling normal spacing to reduce turf damage. Engine hour meters on 2 vehicles, preserved in a later maintenance annex, recorded prolonged low-gear operation. The ascent consumed the morning. By midday, the tanks looked down on the lateral track that fed the German guns. A single salvo from canted positions cut the road's resupply while infantry pushed the lower line. The measurable effect appears in the division's evening AAR. Time from first contact to breach of the gun position shortened by nearly a third compared to the prior road-bound attempt, with mine stocks left unused because the intended kill box was never entered. German counter-battery fire did arrive, but it fell where the plan expected a column in the bend, not a set of holes tucked above the timber edge. Case Study 2. Defense held by height. In the coastal Caucasus, 2 years earlier, near the Tuapse Road in late October of 1942, Soviet defenders had learned that heights controlled roads. A regiment received 3 T-34s and a pioneer detachment by lorry. Instead of keeping the tanks on the narrow highway under German artillery observation, a battalion commander pushed them up terraced logging cuts behind Kadezhensk. Unit diaries note the gradient as at the limit, with the towing cables laid out for mutual aid. When a German armored group attempted to force the bend below, the tanks fired down into the column from positions that had not been pre-sighted. The roadblock held through the day with fewer tank losses than when the same unit tried to meet the attack head-on the week prior. The witness objects are dry. A battalion ammunition ledger shows expenditure dominated by high explosive, not armor-piercing, because the angles exposed roofs and engine decks. A maintenance card marks 1 thrown track, repaired under timber cover. The surprise here did not produce a breakthrough. It bought time in a sector where time measured the survival of the coastal road network. Case Study 3. doctrine pivot in the foothills. During the Vistula Oder push in January of 1945, tank brigades supporting rifle armies met a different obstacle set in the Silesian foreland. Bridge demolitions staggered along. Streams feeding the Oder, with anti-tank guns dug in on the far banks. A front-level order, quoting the autumn memoranda, told brigades to mirror march the road from the upland side where slopes allowed. Near Bielsko-Biała, a brigade climbed field ridgelines paralleling a blown bridge and appeared on a farm shelf behind the gun line by afternoon. An aerial photo in the Army's Recce album shows the line of advance as pale dashes in winter stubble, well above the stream course. The measurable effect appears in the Corps report. Crossing times shrank because sappers could focus bridging effort on infantry and support guns, while the medium tanks bypassed the gap entirely. German accounts and captured signals. Traffic note, armor in upland fields, contrary to map estimate. A phrase that reads like a doctrine cracking at the edges. The opponent adapted. German engineers felled trees across likely meadow bands and scattered anti-personnel mines on upland shelves. Anti-tank guns moved to reverse slopes and clearings cut higher than before. Light flak pieces were emplaced in tree-lined gaps as high-angle ground guns. Infantry formed Panzerfaust hunting parties tasked to crest lines before tanks could anchor. Nebelwerfer batteries fired airbursts into woodland mouths where cables and saw teams tended to mass. These measures worked when terrain funneled the ascent into a single gap or when weather turned turf to soup. Yet they often underperformed, for reasons legible in the witness paper. Depression limits on guns emplaced to face roads still left blind spots to their own backs. Clearing new high-angle positions took time, and motor transport that headquarters had already promised to other crises. Mines scattered on upland meadows suffered from shallow burials in sod, their fuses unreliable in hard frost, and the Panzerfaust teams needed the one asset the Alpine defense never had enough of: time on the ridge before the climbers arrived. Mid-act, the method's limitation forced refinement. A cluster of maintenance pages from a tank brigade in early November lists a spike in final drive failures after repeated uphill hauls and a rash of track pin shears when drivers tried to turn sharply on soft shelves. A training bulletin responded by mandating cooling halts at set elevation intervals and forbidding pivot turns on meadows. Another problem showed up in signals. Radios under canopy suffered range loss. Liaison runners burned minutes on foot between sappers and tanks. The fix was procedural rather than glamorous. Armies assigned a dedicated line of sight relay on each ascent, often a half-track or even a standing signalman with a panel on a bare spur. A quartermaster note adds a small but telling addition. Winter issues included bolt-on ice grousers for track shoes in foothill brigades expected to climb. Authority kept pace. Stavka summaries that winter highlighted formations that demonstrated upland transit, and factory liaisons were dispatched to forward workshops to collect hillwear breakage for redesign. Transport commands reserved gondola cars for timber loads near assembly areas, a banal line in a rail schedule that meant sappers did not arrive empty-handed at the foot of a slope. A spring circular folded the hillside method into standard assault planning checklists: aerial photo requisition, slope walk with bayonet probe, fasciné staging, cable assignments, cooling schedule, relay placement. What began as a pencil mark at Dukla became a set line in orders. Parallel upland approach. Consider. From the German side, decoded signal summaries in late autumn betray a change in tone. Reports that once described the Carpathian Road as a calculable funnel began to speak of two-level movement and unmapped upland lanes. Corps after-action notes lamented the cost of dragging guns to higher shelves and the scarcity of tractors to do it, especially as fuel priorities bled east to crisis sectors. A regimental diary near the Beskids records an expedient, felled tree chevaux de frise across meadow bands, that slowed one ascent for an afternoon, but at the cost of exposing the felling parties to observed artillery. Doctrine that had married mines, bends, and culverts to predictable artillery arcs found itself budgeting men and hours for grass and gradient instead. The system, once unmasked, looked simple. Give a medium tank a lane that is not a road, give sappers tools to keep it moving, accept slower tempos, and arrive where the enemy's angles do not fit. It was never cheap in parts or effort. It did not always work. Thaw, ice, and sheer slope punished optimism, but its logic survived contact with paperwork, rail schedules, and the grinding arithmetic of maintenance. And by winter, staff maps in multiple fronts bore the same quiet alterations, new blue pencil bands above roads that used to be the only lines that mattered. The immediate consequence of the upland method appeared not in sweeping arrows on wall maps, but in the rhythms of daily situation reports. In mid-September, at Dukla, German records counted mine belts along the valley road untouched, while flanking fire struck resupply tracks from above. By the end of the month, rifle divisions reported shorter halts in front of anti-tank strongpoints because engineers could concentrate bridging on infantry and artillery, while tank brigades bypassed the bottlenecks via slopes. Unit AAR pages captured the pattern in plain tables. Road block assaults that had previously cost half a day, and a dozen vehicles now fell in hours with fewer mechanical losses than expected. By October, entire sectors of the 1st Panzer Army's frontage were marked by dual approach lines. The valley floor mapped with German obstacles, the hills above scarred by Soviet tank tracks stitched through meadow and spruce. On the 22nd of October, near Lupko Pass, a battalion logged 3 tanks cresting above a defile where German guns waited at culverts. The position fell in a single afternoon. German artillery tried to adjust, but could not lift fast enough into the slope. Soviet units exploited the breach to roll fuel convoys through before nightfall. The gain was not territory measured in kilometers, but tempo. Bridges repaired overnight instead of over 3 days, rifle regiments supplied without delay, and armored brigades back in motion with hours to spare. Operationally, this translated into wider consequences by winter. During the push into southern Poland in January of 1945, upland transit orders issued by 4th Ukrainian Front shortened timelines to the Silesian foreland. Reports from the 38th Army documented crossings made where bridge demolitions had been expected to delay armored brigades for days. Instead, tanks bypassed blown spans by climbing ridges that paralleled the frozen streams. German attempts to redeploy anti-tank guns uphill faltered, consuming motor transport already strained by fuel scarcity. The upland method did not replace road warfare. It supplemented it, doubling the number of axes Soviet staffs could threaten in sectors where terrain had once promised security to defenders. At the strategic level, the ripple effect showed in resource distribution. Soviet quartermasters allocated more pioneer saws, fascine stockpiles, and spare track components to units assigned to Carpathian and Beskid sectors. A production note from a Ural plant in late 1944 registered higher demand for reinforced track pins, traced explicitly to hill work. Front headquarters shifted artillery schedules to anticipate hillside climbs, adjusting fire plans for units that would emerge above a valley instead of through it. On the German side, 1st Panzer Army bled transport capacity into uphill gun moves, drawing tractors and fuel from sectors already under strain. The contradiction at Dukla had cascaded into a strategic budget problem. The Wehrmacht had to defend not only roads, but also slopes once written off as irrelevant. The legacy of the rule break survived the war. Post-war Soviet manuals printed in the late 1940s included chapters on non-road transit of medium tanks, with tables of gradient, soil type, and load spacing drawn almost directly from wartime engineer bulletins. Training grounds near Sverdlovsk added hillside ascents to driver curricula, with instructors citing Dukla as precedent. Warsaw Pact exercises in the 1950s and 60s rehearsed upland approaches in Carpathian terrain, treating roads as only one of several possible armored lanes. The legacy extended to design. Later, medium and main battle tanks emphasized track width, suspension travel, and gear ratios that could sustain hillside transit, with engineers pointing back to field data gathered in 1944. Even beyond Soviet doctrine, NATO planners studied the same. Western analysts in the 1950s circulated captured Soviet field orders describing parallel upland approach. War College lectures in Carlisle and Camberley included the Carpathian case in terrain studies, noting how a single deviation from assumed road dependence had unhinged defensive doctrine. The lesson carried into Cold War planning. Road interdiction could not guarantee denial if a medium tank's mechanics and sappers' saws combined to stitch uphill. The story closed not with spectacle, but with the quiet persistence of altered maps. By spring of 1945, the upland meadows of the Dukla Pass bore twin scars. Stone culverts blasted in the valley, grassed over chevrons on slopes above. The roads returned to civilian use after the war. The scars in the meadows faded under pasture and spruce regrowth. Yet in staff documents and training syllabi, the mark endured. A rule once taken for granted, that tanks moved only on roads in alpine terrain, had been broken, and in its place lay a new assumption. Any slope within the tolerances of gear, track, and sapper time was a potential line of advance. The meadow above Vyshny Komarnik is quiet now, the pasture reclaimed by cattle and the spruce line closing in on the open ground. But the line traced that September morning remained. A broken rule on a rain-slick slope wrote itself into doctrine, and the next generation of soldiers treated it not as an exception, but as a fact.